The morning my grandfather was rushed to the hospital, my brother didn't even bother showing up until he heard the word estate. I remember sitting in the ICU waiting room at 2 a.m., still in my scrubs from a 12-hour shift, my coffee cold in my hands, watching the clock on the wall like it owed me something. My grandfather, my mother's father, the man who taught me how to balance a checkbook before I could drive, was somewhere behind those double doors with tubes in his arms and a machine breathing for him. And I was alone, because when I'd called my brother to tell him, the first thing he said wasn't, "How bad is it?" or "I'm on my way." He said, "Did he update his will?" I didn't answer. I just hung up. My grandfather, Victor, was 79 years old and had spent 40 years as a watchmaker in a small shop in Dayton, Ohio. He fixed clocks and watches and music boxes and anything else with tiny moving parts that other people had given up on. He was meticulous in a way that most people found exhausting, and I found comforting. His handwriting was small and perfectly even. He kept every receipt. He remembered every birthday. He was the kind of man who planned for things, who understood that the small details, if ignored, had a way of becoming enormous problems later. My brother Derek was 42 years old and had been borrowing money from our grandfather since he was 19. I'm not saying that to be cruel, it's just the truth. Derek had a talent for appearing when there was something to gain and disappearing when there was work to be done. He had charm in the way that some people have a good smile, useful in certain situations, dangerous if you trusted it too much. My mother adored him. She always had. He was her firstborn, her boy, and somewhere in her heart she had decided that whatever Derek did, he had a reason for it, and whatever he hadn't done, he'd been meaning to. My grandfather saw things more clearly. He never said it out loud, not to me, but I could tell. When Derek came around, my grandfather would become very quiet and very still in that particular way. He had the way a watchmaker goes still when he notices something wrong with the mechanism. I was 29. I worked as a medical billing specialist at a clinic on the north side of Dayton. I visited my grandfather every Sunday. We played cards and he made coffee too strong, and I let him win at gin rummy, and we didn't talk about Derek unless we had to. 3 weeks before he was hospitalized, my grandfather called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. He asked me to come by on Thursday instead of Sunday. He said he had something he needed to give me. When I arrived Thursday evening, he was sitting at his workbench with a small leather notebook in front of him. Not a journal, it was more like a ledger, dark brown cover, the size of a paperback, worn at the corners. He slid it across the bench to me without saying anything, the way he used to slide a card across the table when he had a good hand. I picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. Inside, the first page had his handwriting in blue ink, for Clara. In case I am not able to explain this myself, "Grandpa, don't read it here," he said. He put his hand over mine, briefly, the way old men do when they want you to understand something without making a scene about it. "Put it somewhere safe, somewhere nobody else is going to find it." "Why? What's in it?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's a record of things that happened, things that were done." He looked at me steadily. "Derek has borrowed from me 7 times in the last 11 years. I have paperwork on every one of those loans. Dates, amounts, signatures. He agreed to repayment terms each time." A pause. "He hasn't repaid a single dollar." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "How much?" $94,000. I didn't say anything. "There's more," he said. 2 years ago, I signed a document that I believed was updating my car insurance. Derek brought it to me, said it was routine, said the agent just needed a signature. I signed it. He folded his hands on the workbench. "I found out 6 months ago that it was a change to my financial power of attorney. It transferred certain authority to Derek in the event of my incapacitation." The room felt very small all of a sudden. "Grandpa, did you talk to a lawyer?" "I have an appointment with my attorney on the 5th of next month," he said. "That appointment is why I'm giving you this now, instead of later. I want you to have it before anything changes." He looked at me with those watchmaker's eyes, steady and precise. "If something happens before the 5th, or if anything seems wrong, take that notebook to Martin Holloway's office. He's my attorney. His number is in the front cover. He knows to expect you." I took the notebook home and put it at the back of my desk drawer, under a folder of old tax returns. I thought about it every day. I told myself he was being careful, that nothing was going to happen before his appointment, that this was just my grandfather being my grandfather, meticulous, prepared, always 3 steps ahead. Then, on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks later, my mother called me at work to tell me he had collapsed in his shop. Massive stroke. They didn't know yet how bad it was. I got to the hospital within 40 minutes. My grandfather was in the ICU, and nobody could tell me anything beyond stable but critical. I sat in the waiting room, and I called Derek, and I hung up when he asked about the estate, and I sat there alone until almost midnight, when my mother finally arrived, looking pale and scared in a way I hadn't seen since my father left us. Derek showed up the next morning, well-rested, in a pressed shirt. He stayed for about 2 hours. He spoke to the doctor. He spoke to my mother. He asked several pointed questions about my grandfather's arrangements and assets, and he was relentlessly, exhaustingly charming to every nurse who walked past. I watched him from across the waiting room and said very little. On the second day, Derek offered to drive to my grandfather's house to pick up some of his personal items, his reading glasses, his house slippers, things that might comfort him if he regained consciousness. My mother thought this was very thoughtful. I offered to go instead. Derek said he didn't mind. He was already going. That evening, I drove to my grandfather's house to check on it. The house was unlocked. Some papers on his desk had been moved. His filing cabinet in the back room was open. The middle drawer pulled out slightly further than it should have been. I stood in that back room for a long moment. Then I went to my grandfather's workbench, where he kept a small, fireproof lockbox bolted to the underside of the shelf. I had known about it since I was 12 years old, because he had shown it to me and trusted me with the combination. Inside was a copy of his will, his insurance cards, and the business card for Martin Holloway, attorney at law. Everything was still there. Whatever Derek had been looking for, he hadn't found it. I took the business card. The next morning, I drove to my apartment first and retrieved the leather notebook from the back of my desk drawer. I held it in both hands for a moment before I put it in my bag. My grandfather had given it to me for a reason. He had been specific. If anything happens, take it to Martin Holloway. Something had happened. I called Mr. Holloway's office when they opened at 9. His assistant told me he was in court until noon but could see me at 2 o'clock. I said I would be there. I went back to the hospital in the morning. My grandfather's condition was unchanged. Derek was there, standing in the hallway outside the ICU, talking on his phone in a low voice. When he saw me, he ended the call and smiled. "Any news?" "No change," I said. He nodded slowly. Then he said, very casually, "Hey, did Grandpa ever give you anything? Documents, paperwork, anything like that?" Mom was asking. My mother had not been asking. I knew this, the way you know things about people you've spent your whole life watching. "No," I said. "Why?" He shrugged. "Just trying to keep track of things. In case he needs us to manage something for him. I'll let you know if anything comes up," I said. I went and sat with my mother and stayed for 2 hours and then told them I had to go back to work. At 2 o'clock, I walked into Martin Holloway's office. He was a small man in his late 60s, with a precise white beard and the kind of permanent patience in his face that comes from spending decades dealing with families in crisis. I sat across from his desk and put the leather notebook in front of him without saying anything, the same way my grandfather had put it in front of me. He looked at it. Then he looked at me. "He gave this to you 3 weeks ago," I said. "He told me to bring it here if anything happened before his appointment on the 5th. Mr. Holloway picked up the notebook and opened it. He read the first 2 pages without any change in his expression. Then he turned to page 3, and he went very still. Not the polite stillness of a professional keeping his face neutral. Something different. The way a person goes still when they recognize something alarming. He turned another page. Then he set the notebook flat on the desk and looked at me directly. "Miss Clara," he said, "I need to ask you to wait here for about 15 minutes. I need to make a phone call before we continue." "What is it?" I asked. "What's wrong?" He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. "Your grandfather first came to me 18 months ago with concerns about a document he had signed. We had been working together to investigate whether that document was legally valid or whether it had been obtained improperly." He tapped the notebook lightly. What's in here is significantly more detailed than what he had been able to give me previously. If this information is accurate, and I have every reason to believe it is, given your grandfather's documentation habits, then we are looking at something beyond a civil matter. I stared at him. What does that mean? It means I need to call the detective I've been working with on this case, he said. Your grandfather had already reported his concerns to the Financial Crimes Unit 6 weeks ago. This notebook may be exactly what they've been waiting for. My grandfather had gone to the police. He had gone to his attorney. He had documented everything in that precise, meticulous handwriting for 40 years. He had handed the notebook to the one person in the family he knew would take it directly to the right place, without being talked out of it, without being charmed, without being told she was overreacting. He had planned for this, even this. I sat in Martin Holloway's waiting room while he made his calls. I drank bad waiting room coffee and stared at a watercolor painting of the Ohio River on the wall and thought about all the Sundays I had sat at my grandfather's workbench, watching him work on a broken clock, coaxing the mechanism back into order with tools small enough to fit through the eye of a needle. He used to say that most things could be fixed if you were patient enough and precise enough and willing to take the whole thing apart to find the one piece that was causing all the damage. He had spent years being patient and precise. He had found the piece. When Mr. Holloway came back into the waiting room, he asked me to come back into his office. He told me that the detective assigned to the case had been updated and that they would be moving forward with what was in the notebook. He explained to me, carefully and without drama, what Derek had done. The document Derek had presented to my grandfather 2 years ago had not been a simple power of attorney. It had granted Derek broad financial authority, and Derek had used it. Over 14 months, he had made 6 transfers from an account my grandfather rarely checked, an older savings account he'd had since the 1980s. The total was $41,000. He had also attempted, 8 months ago, to refinance a small piece of property my grandfather owned outside of Kettering, using that same power of attorney. That attempt had failed because the title company had flagged inconsistencies in the documentation, but no one had followed up on it until my grandfather found out and went to Mr. Holloway. On top of all that, the notebook contained my grandfather's detailed record of every loan Derek had taken, with signatures, $94,000. Derek had, in fact, signed agreements to repay them. That made them legally enforceable debt. I drove home that evening in the kind of silence that feels loud. I made dinner and didn't eat it and sat on my couch with my grandfather's copy of the will which Mr. Holloway had advised me to keep secured in my possession, given the circumstances, and I thought about Derek at the hospital that morning, asking me in that casual voice if Grandpa had ever given me any documents. I thought about how practiced the question had been, how light. I wondered how long he had known the notebook existed. I wondered if that was why he had been so quick to volunteer to go to the grandfather's house. I thought about the open filing cabinet drawer and felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but was somewhere between them. 2 days later, Derek was arrested. I was at the hospital when it happened. I was sitting with my mother in the waiting room when her phone rang, and she answered it, and the color left her face so completely and so quickly that I reached over and took her hand before she had even said a word. The charges were elder financial abuse, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. There would likely be more as the investigation continued. According to Detective Warren, who called me that evening to update me, Mr. Holloway had been right. The notebook had been exactly what they needed. My mother did not speak to me for 9 days. I understood. I'm not saying it didn't hurt, because it did. But I understood. She had spent 40 years deciding who Derek was, and changing that picture required dismantling something she had built very carefully over a very long time. It was easier, for a while, to be angry at me for being the person who had handed over the notebook than to be angry at Derek for being the reason the notebook existed. On the 10th day, she called me. She didn't say much. She asked how I was doing, and I said I was okay. And she said she was sorry, and I said I knew. And we were quiet on the phone for a long moment. He knew, she said finally. Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing when he gave that to you. Yes, I said. He did. He picked you because you wouldn't let anyone talk you out of it. I didn't say anything to that. I just listened to her breathe on the other end of the line. I signed something, she said quietly. A couple years ago. Derek asked me to sign something as a witness and I didn't read it carefully. She stopped. I just trusted him. I know, Mom. I should have read it. Yes, I said, but you didn't do anything wrong on purpose. There's a difference. She was quiet for a moment. He took money from Dad, his own grandfather. Yes. For years. Yes. She didn't cry. My mother isn't a crier. But something in her voice shifted, like a key turning, like a mechanism clicking into a different position. I want to come to the hospital with you tomorrow, she said. Okay, I said. I'll pick you up at 9. My grandfather regained partial consciousness 3 weeks after his stroke. He couldn't speak clearly yet, and the doctors were cautious about long-term prognosis, but he was awake. He recognized me. When I came into the ICU room and he opened his eyes and saw me, he raised 2 fingers off the blanket in that small, precise way of his not quite a wave, just an acknowledgement, and I sat down next to him and put my hand over those 2 fingers and said, "It's done, Grandpa. Mr. Holloway took care of it. Everything is okay." He looked at me for a long time. Then he closed his eyes again, and the tension around his mouth, that watchmaker's stillness that had been sitting on his face like a held breath, eased, just slightly, and he slept. Derek's case took 8 months to work through the legal process. He ultimately pleaded guilty to elder financial abuse and 2 counts of fraud. He was sentenced to 4 years and ordered to make full restitution, the $41,000 in transfers and the $94,000 in unpaid loans, totaling $135,000. His attorney argued for leniency. The judge was unmoved. The documentation was too thorough, too precise, too complete. My grandfather had recorded everything with the same patience and precision he brought to every broken mechanism he had ever taken apart on that workbench. I learned something during those 8 months that I think about often. My grandfather never told me what was in the notebook because he trusted me to take it to the right person without knowing. He understood the way he understood mechanisms that if I had known the full weight of what I was carrying, I might have hesitated. I might have wanted to confront Derek first, or talk to my mother first, or give Derek a chance to explain himself first. He knew me well enough to know that I would want to be fair. And he protected me from my own fairness by keeping me in the dark just long enough to get the notebook to the one person who knew exactly what to do with it. He fixed the clock. He just needed me to carry the piece. My grandfather moved to a rehabilitation facility in the spring. He walked with a cane now, and his speech was still slow, but his mind was precise as ever. He beat me at gin rummy 6 weeks after they moved him to the rehab wing. He counted cards. I was almost certain. And when I accused him of it, he gave me a look of such complete and dignified innocence that I started laughing and didn't stop for a long time. My mother visited him every other day. She brought him his coffee from the shop 2 blocks from his house, the one that made it the way he liked, strong enough to stand up in a cup, and she sat with him for hours. I don't know everything they talked about. I don't think I need to know. Some repairs happen between 2 people, and the rest of the world is patient and waits outside. There was a moment, about 4 months after Derek was sentenced, when I was cleaning out my grandfather's house to prepare it for rental while he was in rehabilitation. I was going through his workbench, carefully boxing the tiny tools and the spare parts and the half-finished projects, and I found a watch I hadn't seen before. It was a small pocket watch, very old, engraved on the back with initials that weren't my grandfather's. I turned it over. Inside the case, tucked against the movement, was a folded slip of paper. I unfolded it and read my grandfather's small, even handwriting. For Clara, when she needs to remember, a mechanism only works when every part is honest. The one dishonest piece breaks the whole thing. You were always the honest piece. I sat down on the floor of my grandfather's workshop, and I held that pocket watch and that piece of paper for a long time. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there in the quiet of that small room that smelled like machine oil and old wood, surrounded by decades of careful work. And I understood something I hadn't put into words before. My grandfather hadn't just given me a notebook to carry to a lawyer. He had spent 79 years becoming a person so meticulous, so honest, so precise in his trust that when the moment came, the right person knew exactly what to do. Not because she was clever, not because she was brave, but because she was honest. and he had recognized that in her when she was young, and he had protected it, quietly and carefully, the same way he protected every small and delicate thing worth preserving. I took the pocket watch home. I had it repaired. There was a small part of the movement that had worn down over time, and I put it on my desk where I can see it every morning when I sit down to work. It keeps perfect time.